Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, I think you've just turned in homework number 8 on the blackboard. The next assignment, homework number 9, has to do with a new topic that we're going to be introducing today, benefit cost analysis. That assignment's due a week from today. And then just as a reminder, I'm continuing to get some good questions about the project. I'm glad to see that some of you are really putting in a lot of effort early on to try and relieve how much effort you're going to need later in the semester when things really get busy. So it's good to get ahead on that. The project is due on Friday the 17th, but my suggestion has been that you try and really get the majority of it done during spring break, and then you'll have the whole rest of the time to just work on editing the report and cleaning up any mistakes you might have. And so at any time, if you want to bring your spreadsheet file to me and show me what you've done, then I'll look it over and point you in the right direction if I think maybe you need some adjustments, or give you the thumbs up if I think you're headed in the right direction. So get an early start on that and let me know how I can help. Okay, so are there any questions related to the announcements? All right, today we're going to talk about benefit cost analysis. And so far in the course, we've been considering things from the perspective of a company that's trying to maximize profit. And that's really been our only aim in all of these analyses we've done, whether it's been present worth analysis or annual worth analysis, internal rate of return, external rate of return, incremental internal rate of return. Our decision criteria has always been limited to which choice is going to maximize the profits that a company is going to be earning. And the reality is that there's more to life than money. And so just as an illustration, where there are sometimes decisions we make that the most profitable option isn't the choice that we select, consider food aid, just as an example. If you're giving away food to people who are starving, by definition, you're not getting paid for it because you're giving it away. But some people are doing that. Some people make donations to starving people, and so there must be some motivation for them to do that besides maximizing profit. Because if you wanted to maximize profit, dumping it in the ocean would be cheaper than flying it all the way over to where it needs to go. So that's one illustration. Another would be in the case of highway safety. And so consider the guardrails that you see alongside the freeway. And they've made some recent improvements to Interstate 64, where they've, I think, refurbished a lot of the guardrails that are in the median that separate the eastbound and the westbound lanes of traffic. And so it's really expensive if you think about the labor cost having to do with installing a guardrail, and the cost of the steel and the engineering expenses that go into that. It would be cheaper if that guardrail wasn't there. But there must be some value to preventing accidents and reducing the risk of injury and loss of life, where the people who are paying for that guardrail aren't necessarily the ones who are benefiting. You know, the State Division of Highways is the one who is paying for the improvement, and of course indirectly we're all paying for it. Those of us who contribute to the roadway funds through purchasing fuel, because there's a portion of your fuel surcharge that goes into road maintenance. People who register their cars are contributing to the transportation fund, and so we all kind of pay for it indirectly. But the point is if you're going to maximize revenue, then something like safety may not be a top priority. It's just only when you have other goals like helping people in need, or preventing injuries and accidents, other goals like limiting noise exposure to neighborhoods that are adjacent to highways. So this is a photograph of a noise barrier. And you can see that this is a continuous wall, and on the other side of that wall there may be apartments or homes, but the thing is this is going to be a very expensive structure to put into place, and you don't necessarily have to pay for noise pollution. It's an example of there are a lot of things in life where you don't have to pay for the externalities, as they're called. You can light a big fire and create smoke, and the smoke can drift into your neighbor's yard, and you don't have to pay for the privilege of disturbing them or for reducing their air quality. Or in the case of noise, you could turn the radio up really loud, and if you live in an apartment complex, you don't have to pay any kind of a penalty or a fee to your neighbors. And so in a case like this, where people have made the decision that they're going to not only install these expensive guardrails, but then go a huge step beyond that and protect the environmental well-being to limit the noise of the people on the other side, that's an illustration that maybe there's sometimes decisions other than profits. And so there are other factors worth considering, and maximizing profit isn't always the top priority. Same with preserving water quality. So here's a picture of people in India who are using this really polluted water. They're using it for bathing and washing clothes. And fortunately, our water quality, for the most part, in the United States is much better than this. And so, you're not necessarily having to pay to pollute in the United States. You have to get a permit to pollute, but you don't have to pay for it. And so the cost of landfilling your garbage is more expensive than just throwing it out the window. But we value things like environmental protection and limiting litter, so we're able to make that compromise. It's not always just about the money. Here's a new slide that I just put in this morning. Think about how expensive it's going to be to fight this new pandemic of the coronavirus. And this is a picture from Italy where they've instituted a mandatory quarantine for, I think, 16 million people, or probably more by now, are in a quarantine where they're not allowed to leave essentially the region that they live in. It's maybe about the size of a county. And so they're quarantined. People aren't going to work. They're not going to school. There's going to be huge expenses having to do with treating the people who are sick. And so limiting the cost of transmission of the disease is something that people are willing to pay for because it's less expensive to prevent the disease from getting out of control than to have all the loss of life and the medical expenses that go along with it. So public health is an example of something where if you maximize profits, you maybe wouldn't want to provide vaccines for people who can't pay. But if there are other objectives like promoting a healthy population, then giving away free vaccines suddenly does start to make sense. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about now are public sector projects where the goal is more than just maximizing profit. The private sector projects that we've been talking about so far have been relatively easy to select because we'd have a specific decision criteria that said, if our rate of return is greater than the minimum, then accept this project. But now it's a little more fuzzy than that because there's going to be all sorts of spending opportunities that would fail the test of profitability. And so, for example, there may be bridges where you're trying to connect a community that would otherwise be isolated and remote. So you're improving their way of life by bringing them back into the mainstream and easier access to the rest of town. There may be things like parks and recreation where people aren't paying to use some of these things. Some of these things have a toll. There could be a toll bridge or a toll road, but not all of them. Some of them generate revenue, like public utilities that are selling water to their customers. They do charge the customers, and so it's not always the case that no money is changing hands, but in some cases they're not charging as much as they could. They're limited to just operate at no profit, no loss, and so they're trying to break even, some of these public utilities. So there are some communities where they, for instance, own their own electricity generation, and they don't have to use a private company like we have here in the area. We have AEP as our electricity utility. There are some places where the city or a county agency owns the electric company, and so they're selling electricity at to their customers at just enough so they're trying to break even. Some additional examples of public sector projects that can be really expensive, and that's sometimes part of the reason why they're public sector projects, not just because they don't generate profits, but also there are some of these cases where there's so much money required up front that a single private company would maybe be hard-pressed to get enough money together to build the thing. And so take an airport, for example. Airports and even just airport expansions can cost many billions of dollars. And so a private company maybe wouldn't be able to look over the long term to borrow enough money to make it possible to develop a port or make an airport or put in a new roadway, or like a really long road. Where there are toll roads that are privately owned, they're usually relatively short. A big interstate system, though, would have to be public financed because of the enormous cost. So the purpose of these public sector projects is to provide services at no profit. So here is a list, compare and contrast. And you know, on your exams there's often short answer questions where I'm asking you to explain a certain thing. And usually on the final or the second midterm I'll ask a question that compares and contrasts public projects versus private projects. And so this is an important slide because it helps you to understand why certain projects would be undertaken by a private company and certain projects would be taken on by a public entity like a county or a municipal government. And so if you look at the size of investment required, that's one of the distinguishing features, is that there are some private companies that can make huge investments. Most notably, like oil companies can spend billions of dollars to develop an oil field, but those are the exception. Most large investments are made by public sector, and so think about sewers or roads. Those big outlays have to be made by governments that are able to borrow money at a lower rate because they have the power to tax, and so therefore they have really low interest rates because they're considered more stable than private companies. But because of this ability to borrow at a low rate, the public sector is also able to take on projects that have a longer time frame. Private companies are usually looking for a quicker return because their stockholders are kind of living quarter to quarter. They want to know about the profitability in the last 3 months and are less interested about how a certain project is going to be profitable over the really long term. People have a short attention span sometimes, and so public projects are required for these longer ones. Of course, the difference between no profit and profit driven should be self-evident, but where the money comes from is another big difference. Public sector projects can be financed by taxes, whereas private companies don't have the capacity to tax. They can sell ownership interests in their firms through selling stock. They can borrow money, and municipal governments can also borrow money through bonds. But the power to tax is probably the greatest resource that governments have. They have a legal right to take money from their citizens, and as long as the economy itself is doing well, then that capacity to tax is seen as a pretty secure bet. And so that's why they can have low interest rates compared to companies. Is, remember, interest rates are a reward for risk. And so if you're loaning money to a public sector to build a new big infrastructure thing, there's less of a risk that they'll default. Now, there still are some public sector projects that do default, but they're pretty rare. The last thing I want to point out is the selection criteria. Multiple criteria means that you're trying to satisfy lots of different people who have competing interests. Whereas in the case of a private company, you're just trying to maximize your rate of return. In the case of a public project, you may be trying to satisfy both the poor people who live in a certain neighborhood that's going to be affected by construction, and you're balancing out the needs of businesses who are interested in moving into an area, and maybe you'll be balancing the concerns of rich people who are less concerned about the noise and pollution and delay that are going to be affected by the people where the project is taking place. And so you're balancing all of these competing demands, and that's the political process. That's the environment of evaluation. Politics is kind of the art of balancing scarce resources among different interest groups. One last thing I'll mention is that, of course, the government has to take money away from other things to do any project. And so we should always be sensitive to the fact that, yes, they have the legal right to tax people, but they usually are less efficient in allocating the taxed resources than the people who they'd be taking the money from. So in other words, you can spend your money in a way that's more meaningful to you than someone else could spend it for you, because you know what you like and you know what you value. So, I mean, even if I spent $100 on you and I got to choose what that $100 went to, it would be less efficient than if you just spent it on yourself and picked something that you wanted. So it's important for us to have some of these public infrastructure projects. You wouldn't want to live in a society that didn't have roads, didn't have clean water, didn't have clean air. So those things are important, but there is a limit of how much should be taken away and put into the public sector. It's best to have a mixed economy where the private sector does what it does best and the public sector is focusing on its competitive advantage, which is those projects that are too long and too big to be undertaken by the private sector. Any questions about this comparison? All right, so let me ask you this. If you had to pay to get out of being stuck in traffic, how much would you pay? Let's say that you need to drive to Charleston, and you can either sit in traffic for an hour or pay a certain amount to not sit in that traffic. How much would you be willing to pay? Raise your hand if you'd be willing to pay $1 to get out of sitting in a traffic jam for 1 hour. Everybody here is worth, your time is worth $1 an hour, all right? Would you pay $100 to get out of sitting in traffic for 1 hour? Maybe if you're missing a flight, you'd pay $100, or if you're in the middle of having a heart attack, or maybe if it's your kid's play, and it's the one time you get to see your kid opening this play. But for the most part, your time's probably not worth $100 an hour. Mine isn't. I'd sit in the delay rather than pay $100 an hour. So down in Florida, where my brother lives, every day when he drives home from work, they have dynamic pricing to use the high octane. There's like a special lane, and you can either go in this special HOV lane if you have 3 or more people in your car, or if you pay. And some days it'll cost 25 cents to drive in that lane, and some days it'll cost $10 to drive in that lane. And the days that they're only charging 25 cents, there's no point in driving in the lane because traffic's moving just fine on the free roads. So they charge a lot when you're going to save a lot of time. And so you just have to decide that day, is it worth it to me to get out of this traffic jam? And so this point of how much would you be willing to pay to get out of traffic, it's different for every person. But what we're going to be doing, this method that you're learning today, you have to monetize questions like, how much is it worth to avoid delay? We're going to have to start assigning dollar values to things that aren't necessarily financial. So delay is one example. Okay, how much is it worth to avoid getting the flu? Or how much is it worth to you to avoid getting the coronavirus? How much would you pay if you could guarantee you're not going to get coronavirus? You walk around not washing your hands, shaking other people's hands. You could be as filthy as you want, but you don't get corona. How much is that worth? $50. I'd pay more than that. I'd pay more than 50 because I'm convinced it's coming. But maybe everybody has a different estimation of risk, though. Some people aren't so worried about it. I'm kind of worried about it. So on a more realistic basis, the way that this would come into play is, how much is it worth to vaccinate people? Like, is it worth providing free flu vaccines? Because the flu comes every year. And of course, you know the flu vaccine is never 100% effective. But if the flu vaccine prevents 50% of infections that would otherwise occur, then that has a huge effect on how easily the flu is transmitted. And so it still has some herd immunity value, even if it's only 50% effective. And so, can you assign a dollar value to that? I mean, it's easy to know what the cost is because, there's the manufacturing expense. So we're not talking about how expensive is it to generate the flu vaccine. We're saying how valuable is it? Like, what's the benefit? And so the way that we'd know the benefit is we'd have to look not just at how much is it worth to everybody based on their opinion, but then also how much is it worth if you now don't skip work, and how much is it worth if the thing that you're doing because you're at work now enables someone else to do the thing that they wanted to do. Like if you work at the airport and now you don't have to skip work, now they're able to have a flight that otherwise they would have canceled. Now there's a whole chain of events that is really hard for us to estimate the dollar value of, but what we're going to do in benefit cost analysis is we're going to try and monetize the benefits of doing a certain thing. So here's another example. Does everybody know that here in West Virginia they stock trout in certain streams? So you can go trout fishing. How much is that worth? We're not talking about the cost. They can calculate very directly what's the cost, but now think about the benefits. There may be some benefits that are relatively easy to monetize, like there's out-of-state people who drive to West Virginia and now they're spending money on fishing gear, they're booking hotels, and they're eating out in restaurants, and so there's like the tourism value. But then now also think about how much is it worth in your heart to go do some recreation that you love, like just going to the park, playing in the park with a child or something, or going for a bicycle ride on a path, or going for a run through the woods. It's really difficult to monetize some of those things, but we're going to try and do that because it's required to do benefit cost analysis. And by the same token, we also have to try and monetize what are called disbenefits. So even when you're doing something good, somebody's going to suffer. If you're constructing a new road that will eventually alleviate traffic, all the people who drive on that road in the future benefit. But think about the business owners who are affected by the construction when it occurs. If the road outside of your company is torn up for 6 or 8 months, it could totally ruin your business. If there's not an easy way for customers to get into the parking lot, then one particular fast food restaurant may have no customers for weeks and weeks and weeks while the construction is occurring. So we have to monetize the benefits and also monetize what are called disbenefits. So that is the idea behind the benefit cost method, is we try and come up with a dollar value of each project in terms of the benefits of the project, the disbenefits of the project, and then the cost. Cost is easy. Benefits and disbenefits is where you really need a creative economist to do an analysis so that you can quantify it. So here are some definitions. The benefits, we call those the advantages to the public. Time savings, improved reliability. You can see the list of things that we would consider benefits. It's the reason you do the project. The disadvantages are the disbenefits, and like I mentioned, sometimes the people who benefit from a project are different from the people who disbenefit, but we differentiate between the disbenefits and the costs because the costs are the expenses to do the project, not the disadvantages of it. And so environmental damage, delay during construction, reduced quality of life. If there's more noise because an interstate goes through your backyard suddenly, then you'd be experiencing the disbenefit. So you maybe would have a share of the benefits, but you'd have a disproportionate share of the disbenefits. So here's the formula. By the way, we have to take all of these monetized benefits, disbenefits, and costs either to the present, annual basis, or future basis. We have to take all those amounts to the same time before we can combine them. And costs are already known to be expenses. And so you don't have to put the minus sign into the formula that I'm going to show you in just a moment for the costs. And if you do have savings, like if something is less expensive than it used to be, then those are subtracted from the costs. So here's the formula. Benefits minus disbenefits go in the numerator. And in the denominator, we put all of the costs. And so they call it benefit cost analysis, B to C, because up top are the benefits, down below are the costs. And our criteria is if it's greater than or equal to 1, then that means to accept the project. Now think about what that means. What it means is that if a project is going to yield more than $1 of benefits for each $1 of costs, then that means you should do the project. In other words, if I can get $1.10 of benefits by only spending $1, then I should spend the $1. As long as you're getting back more than you are giving, you should accept each dollar that you're able to spend. And so this is the conventional benefit cost ratio. There's also what's called the modified B to C method, and all it simply does is you subtract the ongoing maintenance and operation costs from the benefits. The conventional method is more common than the modified. There's also something called the profitability index, and it is considered when a project is being undertaken by a partner. Now, for example, the Marshall Rec here on campus was built and is operated by a private company. The university doesn't own that building, and the university doesn't really set the operating policies. The people who work there aren't university employees. It's an example of a public-private partnership that built that rec. And so if that private partner were going to assess the profitability index, then you'll notice what they would take into account would be the benefits minus the costs on a maintenance and operation, the ongoing annual expenses divided by the initial cost. And so the disbenefits are excluded because whatever disadvantages occur in a project aren't borne by the private partner. Remember, by definition, disbenefits are borne by the general public. So these are the formulas that we're going to apply in today's in-class exercise. So you're going to analyze the scenario of what if a new highway is going to be constructed, and we want to figure out whether, well, it's proposed anyway. We get to decide if it's going to be constructed. We have to analyze whether or not it's justified. Okay, so the 4% table's on the back side. You've got all the formulas you need. We're going to analyze this over a 20-year study period and try and find out whether this highway should be built. Is it justified or not justified? And remember, the criteria is we're looking to see if the B to C ratio is greater than 1. All right, you may not have time to work through all of the calculations, and so let me just describe the analysis. So we find the present value of all of the costs, and there's 3 components of the cost. There's the $4 million that's already at the future, and then the $18 million each year for 4 years we have to take to the future with P/A. And so that factor, when we look it up out of the table, 3.6299. So we take the $18 million to the future, and then there's just that single lump sum of $4 million in year 5 that you take back to time 0 with P/F, 4%, n equals 5. So the sum of the initial costs are $72.6 million. The maintenance and operation costs are $1 million per year, and the factor to take 20 of those $1 million payments back to the present is 13.59. So that's 13.59 million is the maintenance and operation cost. And so we've got C sub I and C sub M and O. The benefits, we have 3 million that is recurring once a year for 10 years, and then 5 million that occurs from years 11 through 20. And so there's 10 of those $5 million payments. And so what we do with the P/A is take the annual series to year 10, and then with the P/F, that takes the that lump sum that was the equivalent of years 11 through 20. It takes it to from year 10 back to the present. And so the sum of the benefits are going to be 51.7 million because we've taken that 3 million annual series and the 5 million annual series, both of them back to the present. And the reason why we have two factors for the 5 million is there's the find the lump sum based on the annual series and then take that lump sum from year 10 back to year 0. That's what the second factor is. Similar thing with the disbenefits. We've got a lump sum of 10 million and then a disbenefits, 2 years at 5 million and then 3 years at 2 million. And so taking all of those disbenefits to the present, we can now put it into the conventional B to C ratio. And what we see is that since the ratio is less than 1, that means if you spend $1, you're only getting 41.4 cents of benefits. So this project is not justified according to the conventional B to C ratio. Conventional B to C says that you're actually spending more than you're getting back. And if we do the modified B to C ratio, the view is even worse. You're only getting 30 cents of benefit for each dollar of costs, according to the modified ratio. And the profitability index says that even for the project partner, even when you exclude the disbenefits and just consider it strictly from the benefits and costs, you're only getting 52 cents of return for every dollar of cost. And so no matter how you look at it, this project is not justified. Okay, so just as a reminder for the announcements, this next homework assignment, which includes problems similar to what you've just done in this in-class exercise, that assignment's due a week from today, and then also keep working and thinking about the project. I'll see you on Wednesday.